What are you doing?
The rain fell heavily over Seoul that night, as if the sky itself mourned something yet to come. Inside a hospital lit only by cold lamps, Han Ji-won lay in a bed, her skin pale and her eyes tired, breathing heavily as the sound of monitors filled the silence. Standing beside her was her husband, the imposing CEO Seokjin, whose expression betrayed neither compassion nor pain, but an almost cruel coldness, as if her every frail heartbeat were merely a reminder of the burden he carried. He didn't hold her hand, didn't offer words of comfort, just watched her with a distant gaze, as if he had already made a decision he never intended to take back. In the hallway, footsteps echoed steadily, and soon the door slowly opened, revealing Yoo Na-kyung, his lover, who appeared radiant, as if unaware of the gravity of the scene she was interrupting. Her elegant clothes contrasted with the hospital setting, and in her hands were neither flowers nor cards of affection, but a discreet leather bag, carrying boxes of medicine still sealed, the fate of which Ji-won would never know. Seokjin looked away from his ailing wife to the new presence in his life, and the sparkle in his eyes, absent from the woman who had been with him for years, was rekindled by this figure who brought with her not only youth, but also promises of pleasure and social status. Ji-won, even weakened, noticed the silent exchange of glances between the two, and a suffocating tightness gripped her chest, more painful than any symptom of the disease consuming her. In that instant, she understood that the love that had once sustained her was dissolving before her eyes, and that the man who should have been her protector saw her only as a burdensome burden. The hospital, which should have been a refuge, became the stage for a silent betrayal, marked by cold gestures and dark promises. And it was precisely that night, between the damp walls of the hospital, that Seokjin believed he was choosing the path to freedom, when in fact he was opening the doors to the biggest farce of his life. Before that tragic night in the hospital completely redefined their fates, Seokjin and Ji-won's story seemed, in the eyes of society, an example of success and stability. He, a young visionary businessman and heir to a respected conglomerate, had always been seen as a charismatic and determined leader. She, in turn, was remembered as the discreet and devoted wife, capable of brightening family gatherings with her delicacy and winning over important allies with her refined kindness. Together, they represented the perfect image of a modern Korean couple who combined tradition and progress at every step. In the early years of their marriage, Ji-won spared no effort to be by her husband's side through every challenge that arose. She accompanied him to corporate events, hosted lavish receptions at the family home, and was often the one who bridged the gap between Seokjin and more conservative investors, impressed by her polite and warm welcome. Beyond her social life, Ji-won also took care of intimate details. She managed the household, looked after her elderly mother-in-law's health, and ensured that every aspect of Seokjin's life was in order, so he could shine before the world. However, as happens in many stories marked by ambition and power, time eroded the invisible foundations of that relationship. With the company's growth came constant travel, endless meetings, and the relentless pressure of maintaining control of the empire. Seokjin, ever busier, began returning home late, often without exchanging a single word with Ji-won, who waited patiently in the living room, dinner already cold on the table. The emotional distance between them grew, but she believed it was all part of a cycle that would soon pass. When the disease began to manifest itself, Ji-won still tried to hide the symptoms so as not to worry her husband. Constant coughing, sudden weakness, sleepless nights, signs she attributed to fatigue. However, when medical diagnoses confirmed the severity of the condition, their relationship suffered its first irreversible blow. Seokjin, instead of becoming his wife's safe haven, allowed himself to be consumed by the idea that her fragility would threaten the impeccable image he had built in the market. He began showing up alone at events. At family gatherings, he justified his wife's absence with evasive answers. Little by little, Ji-won realized she was no longer seen as the partner who supported him in everything, but as a bothersome obstacle, a shadow of what she had once represented. Despite all her efforts to maintain composure, silent tears accompanied her in the early hours of the morning when she found herself alone in a cold, empty bed. Still, she continued to believe that deep down, the love that had united them could be salvaged, and that Seokjin would remember who had always been by his side through every battle. However, fate was already beginning to align its pieces in a cruel way. And while Ji-won searched for the strength to resist, a new figure appeared in Seokjin's life, bringing seductive and dangerous promises that would forever change the course of their story. It was on a glamorous night in the heart of Gangnam that Yoo Na-kyung first appeared on Seokjin's radar. The event brought together business people, politicians, and celebrities, all captivated by the glittering lights and the champagne flutes that passed from hand to hand. Amidst the glittering atmosphere, her figure stood out like a beam of light that seemed to cut through the darkness. Elegant in a fitted black dress, with a calculated smile and the confidence of someone who knew the power she wielded over the eyes of those around her. Seokjin, accustomed to being the center of attention, couldn't help but notice the way Na-kyung moved among the guests. Unlike the other women, who approached him with flattery or explicit interest in his business, she seemed in no rush to approach him. It was as if she was certain that sooner or later he would be drawn into her orbit. And indeed, that's what happened. When they finally exchanged words, Na-kyung knew exactly what to say, words wrapped in charm, laced with false understanding, as if she saw in Seokjin not the powerful CEO, but a man burdened by the weight of the world. In the days that followed, their meetings discreetly multiplied. Lunches turned into long dinners. Quick texts turned into late-night phone calls. For Seokjin, her every gesture seemed to fill the void his relationship with Ji-won no longer felt. When Na-kyung said things like, "You deserve to be loved without burdens," he felt a kind of illusory liberation, as if he were being understood for the first time in a long time. The detail few understood was the calculated skill with which Na-kyung infiltrated the circles of power. She used her youth and beauty as a facade, but behind it hid a voracious ambition which grew as Ji-won's health declined. It was as if she had appeared in Seokjin's life at the very moment he was vulnerable, ready to fill the space left by his wife's fragility. Ji-won, even in her delicate condition, noticed the subtle change in her husband's behavior. The colder looks, the increasingly longer absences, the way he turned his phone away whenever a notification popped up. Her feminine intuition, sharpened by pain, revealed to her what words still couldn't confirm. And silently, her heart began to prepare for the inevitable storm. Meanwhile, Na-kyung intensified her presence. Not only did she become Seokjin's companion at social events, but she also encouraged him to distance himself from everything that reminded him of Ji-won. It was as if, with each piece of advice, she whispered the same idea, that he deserved a life free from the chains of a marriage marked by illness. And Seokjin, blinded by vanity and the promise of eternal youth with his lover, allowed this poison to seep into his soul. The game was set, and every piece fell into place with precision. What seemed like an emotional escape would soon turn into an unprecedented public humiliation, leaving scars that would be indelible. The moment that would forever change Ji-won's life happened so publicly and painfully that not even her happiest memories could soften its impact. It was the company's founding anniversary. a luxurious evening designed to impress foreign investors and reaffirm Seokjin's power as a major player in the Korean market. The ballroom of the five-star hotel in the heart of Seoul was packed with business people, journalists, and family members. Everyone was expecting the couple to be there. After all, Ji-won had always been seen as the impeccable wife, the gracious hostess who completed the CEO's perfect image. Dressed in a simple outfit suited to her health limitations, Ji-won made an effort to be present, even against medical advice. She had practiced a smile in the mirror, trying to hide the marks of the disease that made her body more fragile, believing this would be a moment of reconciliation, an opportunity to remember the times when they walked side by side. However, as soon as she entered the hall, she noticed the awkward silence that hung among the guests. Eyes shifted, whispers echoed, and in the background, in an undeniable spotlight, Yoo Na-kyung appeared beside Seokjin, wearing a shimmering red dress that captured everyone's attention. Not only had he brought his lover to the official celebration, he had proudly introduced her as if she were the new lady who would accompany him on these prestigious occasions. Ji-won remained motionless, her eyes welling up, watching the scene unfold before her. When she tried to approach, thinking there might be some mistake, she was surprised by a cutting remark. In a firm voice, and without a hint of hesitation, Seokjin announced to the audience, "My wife will no longer be able to attend these events. Her health prevents her from fulfilling these responsibilities, but I have someone by my side who understands and supports my work." The words, spoken as if they were a rational explanation, felt like daggers in Ji-won's heart. The entire hall fell into a heavy silence until suppressed laughter and expressions of embarrassment spread. Some averted their eyes out of respect. Others watched with cruel curiosity, as if witnessing a theatrical scene where the protagonist was being expelled from the stage without warning. Ji-won tried to maintain her dignity, but her legs felt wobbly. Her breath became shallow, and only willpower kept her from collapsing in front of everyone. Upon returning to the hospital that same night, believing she would at least find some semblance of compassion, she faced the final blow. Seokjin entered the room, placed the wedding ring on the bedside table, and with the same distant look said he wanted a divorce. There were no tears in his eyes, no regret, only the cold conviction of someone who believed she was exchanging the weight of a burden for the lightness of a new beginning. Ji-won, fragile and stunned, stared at that symbol of love transformed into a worthless object, feeling the world silently crumble around her. In that instant, she realized she had not only lost her husband, but also her place in the life she had helped build. Emptiness filled the room, and the feeling of abandonment mixed with the physical pain that was already weakening her. As Seokjin walked away without looking back, the sound of the door closing echoed like the final nail in an invisible coffin, burying years of dedication, love, and sacrifice. The scandal of that night, however, would not end there. What seemed like mere cruel humiliation still held consequences capable of irreversibly scarring everyone involved. Because, while Ji-won wept in silence, something bigger was brewing behind the scenes, ready to turn the tables in the most merciless way possible. After the devastating night of being exposed in front of everyone, Ji-won carried with her not only the physical pain of her illness, but also the crushing weight of rejection. Back in the hospital room, the silence had become even more cruel than Seokjin's words. That space that had once served as a refuge from her fragility now felt like a prison, where memories of humiliation echoed with every passing second. The hallways that once held hope now felt like labyrinths of abandonment, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with tears turned every breath into a suffocating reminder that she had been discarded as worthless. In the following days, Ji-won experienced a painful isolation. Friends who had previously visited her began to distance themselves, embarrassed by the scandal circulating in society columns and newspapers. Her name was mentioned in whispers, always accompanied by looks of pity, as if she were merely a shadow of someone who no longer mattered. Even some family members chose to remain silent, fearful of facing Seokjin's power. The loneliness, which had already crept into her life, now solidified itself as an inescapable presence. Each morning was a challenge. Getting out of bed felt like a battle against invisible forces, and moments of weakness made her believe she was destined to disappear without a trace. The wedding ring, abandoned on the nightstand, became the cruel symbol of what she had lost. Not only a companion, but also the dignity and recognition of a lifetime of dedication. She stared at it, trying to understand when love had turned into such absolute indifference. Meanwhile, Na-kyung increasingly occupied the spaces that had previously belonged to Ji-won. Photographs at social events showed her lover beside Seokjin, smiling and triumphant, as if her place as legitimate wife had always been hers. For Ji-won, each image seen in magazines and newscasts was a new open wound, reminding her that she had been replaced not only in her husband's heart, but also in the public eye of society as a whole. Yet, amidst the silent mourning and the tears spilled onto soaked pillows, something began to blossom within her. It wasn't explosive rage, nor an immediate desire for revenge, but a barely perceptible spark of resilience. An inner voice told her that, despite everything, her story wasn't over yet. This fragile flame, fueled by pain, was beginning to grow stronger, preparing her for a choice that would change everything. And while Seokjin believed he had buried forever the woman who had accompanied him for years, Ji-won slowly discovered that from the greatest of humiliations could arise the most unexpected of strengths. After his collapse, Ji-won disappeared like someone fading from an old photograph. He left the hospital silently, refused visitors, and didn't answer phone calls. To many, it seemed like he had given up on life, but in truth, it was precisely in this silence that he began to write a new page in his life. He discreetly moved to Busan, a coastal city that offered not only fresh sea air, but also the anonymity necessary to rebuild his identity away from the prying eyes of Seoul. In Busan, no one knew her as the rejected wife of a powerful CEO. There, she could walk the streets without her name being associated with scandal, without pitying whispers haunting her. The simple routine began to restore small bits of dignity, preparing her own breakfast, tending to the plants in a small rented apartment, feeling the sea breeze touch her face. Small gestures that once seemed banal now became silent victories against the fate that had tried to destroy her. At the same time, Ji-won decided to seek alternative treatment for her ailing health. At a community clinic, she found not only doctors offering caring care, but also ordinary people who, even facing their own pain, welcomed one another with humanity. There, amid stories of suffering and overcoming, she discovered that she could still be useful, still caring, still transforming pain into strength. She began volunteering, offering words of comfort to patients, organizing small fundraisers, and even translating medical reports for families who didn't understand the technical language. Each gesture of solidarity restored a piece of the woman she believed she had lost. Little by little, the shadow of humiliation became fuel for a new identity, shaped no longer by the role of wife to a powerful man, but by the knowledge that she could in her own right be a source of hope for others. Ji-won learned to smile again, and though the scars still hurt, there was a glow of resilience within them that no one could erase. While Seokjin believed her silence was synonymous with defeat, Ji-won was preparing something much greater in anonymity than he could have imagined. because while the world saw her as a forgotten woman, she was actually strengthening herself for a comeback that would change the course of everything. While Ji-won quietly rebuilt her life away from the spotlight, Seokjin believed he was experiencing the height of his freedom. Alongside Na-kyung, he showed off at events, made headlines as a renewed man, and allowed himself to be photographed with the same vanity of someone who believed he had overcome the constraints of an inconvenient marriage. However, the glow that had seemed so bright began to fade with a speed he could never have predicted. The first sign appeared discreetly, almost imperceptibly. A close associate alerted him to rumors circulating among suppliers. Boxes of high-value medications, originally destined for prestigious hospitals, were appearing in grey markets in Seoul. The matter was treated as behind-the-scenes gossip, but it carried the gravity of a scandal capable of ruining entire careers. Seokjin, in his arrogance, ignored the rumors, believing them to be nothing more than fabrications created by jealous competitors. However, the evidence began to mount, and each clue pointed to a name he never would have thought to question: Yoo Na-kyung. Investigative newspapers, attentive to their mistress's lavish lifestyle, began connecting dots that had previously seemed unconnected. How had she, who until recently had been merely an elegant presence at parties, come to flaunt rare jewelry, imported automobiles, and million-dollar apartments in exclusive neighborhoods? The answers emerged in clandestine photographs and financial records. Na-kyung had infiltrated Seokjin's company's distribution system, diverting medicines intended for critically ill patients and reselling them in criminal schemes. When the first reports broke, the market's reaction was immediate. Investors withdrew capital, clients broke contracts, and the international press covered the name of the conglomerate associated with drug trafficking. Seokjin, who had always prided himself on his impeccable image, saw his empire shake like a house of cards hit by a storm. Yet, instead of facing the facts, he tried to convince everyone that it was a misunderstanding, a conspiracy designed to tarnish his reputation. As the pressure mounted, Na-kyung maintained a disturbing coolness. Faced with the accusations, she smiled cynically, assuring Seokjin that everything was under control. But behind the scenes, she further strengthened her criminal network, convinced she could escape the consequences. What Seokjin didn't realize was that by placing his full trust in this woman, he had signed his own sentence of ruin. Gradually, allies who had once applauded him began to drift away. Invitations to international meetings disappeared, foreign investors refused to welcome him, and even longtime friends opted for silence. Seokjin, accustomed to being in the spotlight, experienced for the first time the feeling of being isolated, the target of looks of distrust and contempt. The same world that had once revered him now saw him as an accomplice in a shameful scheme. The nights became long and restless. Locked in his office, Seokjin relived in his mind the whispers he had previously ignored, realizing too late that each choice led him to an inevitable abyss. The man who had traded Ji-won's loyalty for illusory promises now realized he had become a prisoner of his own ambition. And it was precisely at this moment of decline that destiny began to prepare an unexpected reunion, capable of definitively exposing the contrast between the fragility of illusion and the strength of those who had been reborn from silence. The drug scandal was still reverberating throughout Korea when Seokjin, under pressure to demonstrate his continued control, decided to sponsor a major medical conference in Seoul. The intention was clear: to restore his conglomerate's image, attract positive media attention, and convince investors that he was still the trusted leader he once was. The modern, luxurious auditorium was packed with doctors, business people, and journalists, all attentive to every detail, waiting not only for the lectures but also for developments in the case that was already making headlines. Seokjin walked among the guests with the weight of distrust etched in every glance. Greetings were cold, smiles practiced, and the feeling of isolation became suffocating. Nakyung, at his side, displayed the same calculated confidence, as if nothing could shake the empire they had built. However, the evening held a surprise that would shatter any semblance of security. When the master of ceremonies announced the next speaker, Seokjin's heart skipped a beat. The figure that appeared on stage seemed to have emerged from a dream or a nightmare. Han Ji-won, previously frail and haggard, now presented herself with a firm posture, a confident gaze, and a presence that lit up the entire room. She wore a sober suit, exuding elegance and authority, and her clear, confident voice filled the auditorium as she spoke about a social project for the fair. Distribution of medicines. The shock was immediate. Murmurs spread among the guests, journalists adjusted their cameras, and everyone turned to Seokjin's incredulous face. He couldn't believe his eyes. The woman he had dismissed as weak and hopeless stood before him, stronger than ever, earning the respect of everyone present. Ji-won never once looked at him. She spoke to the audience as if he were nothing more than an irrelevant bystander in the crowd. Her every word was a blade cutting through Seokjin's mask of superiority. As he struggled to maintain his composure, Nakyung felt her confidence waver for the first time, as she realized that Ji-won's presence not only revived the past, but also threatened to destroy all the ground she had gained. And when the lecture ended, with warm applause echoing through the auditorium, Seokjin understood that his life would never be the same again. But what he didn't yet know was to what extent this unexpected return would change everything. That was yet to come. After the devastating reunion at the conference, Seokjin could no longer find peace. The image of Ji-won, haughty, applauded by everyone and completely indifferent to their presence, haunted his every thought. For the first time in years, pride gave way to unease. How could this woman, whom he had called dead weight, have resurfaced so magnificently while he was drowning in scandal and distrust? The following night, unable to contain the turmoil consuming him, Seokjin appeared at the door of the small apartment Ji-won rented in Busan. He held a bouquet of flowers, and on his face was an expression that mixed regret and despair. When she opened the door, there was no surprise in his eyes, only the serenity of someone who had already prepared for this moment. He tried to smile, but his voice faltered as he spoke her name. Ji-won firmly invited him in without enthusiasm, as if offering only a gesture of courtesy. Sitting on the sofa, Seokjin talked non-stop. He recalled their years together, confessed his weaknesses, and said he'd been deceived by Nakyung's appearance. He begged for forgiveness with streaming tears, begged for a second chance, and promised to change and start over. But each word seemed to crash against an invisible wall Ji-won had built within herself. She listened to him silently, her eyes fixed, but unmoved by the emotion he so desperately sought to evoke. When Seokjin finally finished his desperate speech, Ji-won took a deep breath and responded with the calm of someone who had overcome her own wounds. She said that the love that once existed had died the moment he abandoned her in the hospital, and that nothing she could do could restore what was lost. Her words were firm, but not cruel. They were simply the acknowledgement of an irrevocable truth. "What you threw away will never be yours again," she concluded, before standing and opening the door, indicating that the conversation was over. Humiliated, Seokjin staggered. Away, the bouquet still intact in his hands, crushed by the weight of his rejection. For the first time, he experienced the bitter sensation of having no control, of being rejected so completely. But what he hadn't yet imagined was that the worst of the pain was yet to come, when the truth about Nakyang would come out with overwhelming force. The scandal, which had begun as a whisper behind the scenes, reached its peak one grey morning when police cars surrounded Yu Nakyang's luxurious apartment. The press cameras, already alerted by strategic leaks, recorded the moment when boxes and boxes of illegal drugs were removed from the premises, each marked with the seal of Seokjin's company. The news exploded within seconds. The CEO's mistress was not only living off his money, but also running one of the largest drug embezzlement and illegal drug trafficking schemes ever seen in the country. The images broadcast nationally were devastating. Executives in Seoul hung up their phones. At the mention of his name, foreign investors rushed to cancel contracts, and newspapers ran headlines directly linking Seokjin's conglomerate to drug trafficking. His reputation, built over years, was shattered in a matter of hours. Nakyung, once so confident and seductive, appeared handcuffed, her gaze still haughty, but without the glow of someone who believed she held the world in her hands. When questioned by reporters, she offered ambiguous statements, suggesting that Seokjin was fully aware of everything. Even if they were merely provocations, the doubt was already cast, and public opinion quickly judged him an accomplice, even though there was no concrete evidence. Seokjin tried desperately to contain the damage. He called press conferences, hired renowned lawyers, and declared himself a victim of a setup. But nothing seemed enough. With each new report, new details of the scheme emerged, and in every piece of the puzzle, Nakyung emerged as the protagonist. To make matters worse, compromising recordings emerged of meetings in which she flaunted luxuries paid for with embezzled funds, always mentioning the protection of the most powerful man she knew. His downfall was not only corporate but also personal. Former allies began to shun him, family members were ashamed of his name, and employees who had once revered him now looked upon him with contempt. Korean society, so harsh in its criticism, condemned him not only for the crime, but also for the public betrayal of a wife who had now resurfaced as a symbol of dignity and resilience. As Seokjin struggled amidst his ruin, Ji-won watched from a distance, not with a burning desire for revenge, but with the serenity of someone who no longer needed proof to know that fate would exact every tear shed. She never needed to raise her voice or devise elaborate plans. His own arrogance had led him to the abyss. The justice life delivered to her was not made of shouts or spectacles, but of the cruel irony of seeing the man who had scorned her kneeling before the consequences of his choices. That week, the most talked-about scene occurred during a special company meeting. Seokjin, pale and haggard, was removed from his presidency before a board that no longer saw leadership in him, only shame. The document sealing his downfall was coldly signed, while cameras recorded every detail. Among the shareholders present, someone murmured that Ji-won, with her dignified and silent demeanor, had already won without having to lift a finger. And even though it seemed like rock bottom, what awaited Seokjin was an even deeper dive. Complete loneliness, belated regret, and the constant memory of the woman he believed he could erase from his own history. The days following the fall were the longest of Seokjin's life. The man who had once been greeted with reverence now walked the streets amid scornful glances and derisive whispers. His luxurious Gangnam penthouse had become a silent, oppressive space where the hallways echoed with memories of parties, toasts, and promises of eternal success. Now, only the sound of the wind against the windows filled the emptiness surrounding him. The office, once a symbol of power, resembled a mausoleum. The leather chair, once occupied with pride, had become a place of penance. On the desk, stacks of newspapers laid bare his ruin, headlines portraying him as complicit, negligent, or, at the very least, a fool manipulated by an ambitious woman. He leafed through. them in silence, like someone reading their own obituary while alive, trying to understand when his arrogance had blinded him to the abyss that lay ahead. At night, when insomnia gripped him, he sought refuge in old recordings of company events. He relived images of himself with Ji-won when they were still seen as the perfect couple. The contrast was cruel. As he watched her smile, he remembered the moment he abandoned her in the hospital, placing her wedding ring on the table as if it were a disposable burden. Now, alone, he understood that that gesture had been the beginning of his own destruction. The most painful memory, however, was not the public humiliation, but the sight of Ji-won at the conference, radiant, cheered by an audience that had once applauded him. She had not only survived, but been reborn, transforming pain into strength and earning everyone's respect. He, in turn, was wallowing in regret, trapped in a maze of wrong choices. Seokjin tried to write a letter, scrawling apologies, but each sentence sounded hollow. No justification could erase the abandonment, no plea could restore the lost time. He tore the pages apart in despair, scattering pieces across the floor as if they were fragments of his own soul. Amidst this torment, he learned the cruelest lesson. The love he had scorned had been the only one capable of sustaining him. And without it, all that remained was the silence of a broken man. However, life still held the final scene, the symbolic ending that would show everyone, unquestionably, that Ji-won was already moving in a different direction. Life has a unique way of showing that nothing remains hidden forever, and that time, relentless, takes its toll on every choice made. While Seokjin remained trapped in his ruin, Ji-won walked the illuminated streets of Seoul, with the lightness of someone who had overcome not only betrayal, but also the invisible chains that tried to bind her to suffering. Her firm steps echoed like a silent hymn of victory, and every smile exchanged with the people who recognized her for her humanitarian work was proof that her story had not ended in pain, but had been reborn in hope. The woman who had once been seen as fragile and disposable had now become an example of dignity and strength. Her gaze, once filled with insecurity, now shone with a calm confidence. Earned through each silent battle, she fought with herself. Ji-won no longer needed to prove anything to anyone because her own life was a testament to the fact that the truth, even late, always finds a way. She carried no resentment, nor the need for explicit revenge, for she understood that justice had already been served through destiny itself. While Seokjin wallowed in memories and regrets, she built bridges to the future, helping needy patients, inspiring young people, and rebuilding her life on solid foundations. The difference between them was no longer merely circumstantial, but abysmal. He remained trapped in the past, living in a prison built by his own choices, while she flourished in the present, transforming pain into fuel to begin again. Ji-won understood that the greatest form of justice was not to watch his downfall, but to rise above the pain he caused, showing the world that no human heart should be defined by wounds, but rather by the ability to heal them. That night, crossing a lantern-lit square, Ji-won paused for a moment and raised her eyes to the sky. The gentle wind touched her face as a reminder that despite all the tears, there was still beauty to be experienced. She remembered the lonely nights when she believed there was no way out, the times when her chest felt crushed by Seokjin's indifference, and how she had believed herself doomed to live in the shadow of rejection. Now, facing the vastness of the sky, she realized that each tear had been merely the prelude to a new version of herself, stronger, more aware, and freer. The love she had once received had been betrayed. But the self-love she had cultivated amidst the pain was indestructible. It was in this love for herself that she found the courage to rise when everyone believed she would remain fallen. There was no longer room for resentment, only for the certainty that her story was now a testament to overcoming, written with tears but finished with courage. Ji-won learned that forgiving didn't mean forgetting, but rather freeing herself from the weight she didn't deserve to carry. In every social project she led, in every life she touched with her serene presence, she reaffirmed the value of her journey. People who read about her journey saw in her a reflection of their own pain and found hope in the example of someone who transformed abandonment into empowerment. Ji-won, who had once been invisible within her own home, had now become a respected voice among the crowd. Meanwhile, Seokjin, locked in his world of regret, still tried to find justification for his choices. But with each attempt, the mirror returned the image of a broken man, unable to undo what he had done. He watched from afar as the news celebrated Ji-won, but lacked the courage to approach her. Her silence was a reflection of his defeat. He understood there was no room for him in her new life, and this was the cruelest punishment, to see himself excluded not out of revenge, but because he was no longer part of the story of someone who had decided to move on. On that special night, while Seokjin faced the loneliness of his empty apartment, Ji-won was surrounded by young people at a lecture on resilience. She calmly spoke about how pain can be transformed into strength, never naming names, never needing to reveal details everyone already knew. Her words were simple, but carried the depth of someone who had lived every syllable. "We are not defined by what we lose," she said, "but by how we choose to keep walking." The auditorium erupted in applause, and in that moment, it became clear. Ji-won was no longer just a survivor, but a leader, a beacon for all who believed they were doomed by pain. And so, the message that echoed wasn't just for Seokjin, but for everyone who once believed they were broken. No amount of abandonment defines the value of a life, and no betrayal can erase the strength of those who decide to start over. Ji-won moved on, leaving behind what wasn't worth taking, and proving that sometimes the greatest victory is simply keeping going. As she said goodbye to the illuminated square, the lanterns reflecting in her eyes, she understood that the journey didn't end there. The future was a blank page, and she now held the pen in her hand. She was no longer a secondary character in Seokjin's story, but the author of her own life. And as she walked toward the unknown, she carried with her the certainty that each step she took was living proof that suffering can mark, but should never define. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Here, each narrative brings not only emotion, but also reflections that can transform the way you view love, pain, and overcoming. Your presence is an essential part of this journey.